Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome. This week I've got a joint episode I did with Pat Flynn, and we just introduced it right in our conversation, so we'll just jump right into that. All right, well, here I am with Pat Flynn, and we're going to talk about libertarianism, and this is really cool because Pat actually interviewed me way back in November or October of last year on an essay I gave on an ontological argument against agnosticism, and we had a great time talking about that. And that interview was the impetus for me starting my podcast. And now Pat and I are kind of doing a joint podcast talking about libertarianism, where this is going to be on his show and it's going to be on mine. So it's great to talk to you again, Pat. How are you doing this evening?
Yeah, Phil, I'm doing well. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me. I really enjoyed our previous conversation. So I've been wanting to hop back on the podcast with you. So I'm glad that it's over such an exciting topic as political philosophy and libertarianism and how it intersects with Christianity. So cool to be here, my man. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. And I've told you this, but I don't think I've told people who listen to my podcast this, but right now I'm still finishing up my big push on the problem of divine foreknowledge, trying to get somebody to talk about the last view. But after I get that done, I think I want to do a huge segment on political philosophy. So this is a good thing to just preview that. So,
I will say that if it doesn't become apparent as we work our way through here, political philosophy is not my specialty. Interestingly enough, it was sort of one of my early entry points into philosophy, but I pretty quickly, the interesting thing, Phil, and I don't know if this happened for you, but I actually was attracted to libertarianism as a teenager. I never quite fit in with any of the crowds. You know what I mean? I had to make it at T-shirts and all that,
Go ahead.
So libertarianism, it attracted me for a number of reasons, which we'll get into. But the funny thing was trying to work out political philosophy and trying to make a coherent and consistent, system there really quickly led me to bigger philosophical and ultimately theological questions. So it quickly diverted me to other branches of philosophy where I have since spent considerably more time. Metaphysics, ethics. I feel much more comfortable there, and I feel that it's only really fairly recently in the past couple of years that I've wanted to kind of make a return. After spending all this time and on sort of the bigger, grander questions, if you will, of trying to bring it back down to earth on the practical level. So, if nothing else, this might just be a huge brainstorming session. But that's kind of was that similar to you? Because I know that you have kind of your own journey there as well. I'd be curious.
No, actually, when I was in high school, I pretty much bought almost lock, stock, and trade into Republican Party. And it was only as I got older and saw some more of how those policies played out and understood some implications that I moved more in the libertarian direction. I can remember in high school, like you were saying, some of my friends trying to convince me of be a libertarian, because even then I kind of would be like, well, I like what the Republican platform says, but these Republican politicians aren't doing that. And they say, oh, come be with a libertarian. And they would try and pitch me on it by saying, we're going to legalize all the drugs. And I would think, that sounds crazy. How is that your pitch? Come on.
Yeah, unfortunately, the stereotypes are sometimes true.
Yeah. Although, to be fair, these were high school students who probably didn't know any better. When a 50-year-old person who's educated says that, they should know better. When a high school student says that, come on, they're still learning. So. Yeah, so I kind of slided into it more reluctantly than came to embrace it in high school because I thought it sounded cool. I slid into taking a more libertarian stance in politics because I thought this seems to make sense and work better than anything anybody else is saying, so I guess I'm going to go that way.
Yeah, that's, I guess, so mine was different because if anything else, before I really started thinking about politics, I would have probably classified myself as a liberal, just because that's kind of the family line there. So, but as soon as I did start thinking about it, I remember, somebody handed me a couple of Ron Paul books in early high school, and I pretty much liked everything that guy had to say, right from the beginning.
Yeah, I recall the first time I heard that he was running for president. Well, the first time I remember him doing it anyway in one of the debates. I forget if it was like 2000, 2004. I thought, this guy sounds crazy. And about 4 years later, when he did it again, I'm like, no, this makes a lot more sense. And now if he was running again this time around, I'd be like, I'm going to be happy to vote for him.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I was really excited. I remember I was down in the Florida Keys watching the debates when he actually was on the stage, and man, I really felt like he had a shot for a while. Maybe I was a little bit too optimistic. Apparently, I was too optimistic at the time. But just the entire excitement around the Ron Paul movement was something that I had never experienced before, at least not politically in my lifetime. It really was unique. And it's something that has lived on. Unfortunately, I think we've seen a lot of fracturing in what he was. He was kind of a great unifier of the divides in libertarianism. He kind of brought these various schools of libertarian thought together in a way that people actually were able to set aside some of their ideological commitments and really kind of for once, if only for once, libertarians were able to effectively assemble and cooperate and really make a scene, even if it didn't ultimately pan out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I was kind of hoping the last election something like that would happen, because I looked at it and I'm like, we've got the two most unlikable candidates in the history of the country running for the two major parties. Come on, libertarians, this is your time to get in there and shine, to show that you don't have to be beholden to two-party politics. And nope.
Oh man, I mean, it couldn't have been more frustrating, honestly. Yeah. I mean, they throw Johnson in there and Weld. I mean, Weld? Bill Weld? Come on, what a joke! I mean, it was really an insult. It was really a slap in the face, and it really, I would say that actually disenfranchised me. Left a very foul taste in my mouth, because I'm, for the same reasons that you talked about the Republican Party. Yeah, a lot of these ideas make sense, but then in practice, I see a lot of hypocrisy. I don't see people actually standing firm in their principles. That was sort of how the Libertarian Party felt to me once they put Bill Weld on that ticket. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I heard a lot of people criticizing Johnson, saying he's a libertarian. What are you doing nominating him? And so, yeah, I get what you're saying. Well, why don't we move on from talking about our histories to talking about you wrote that blog post, you asked me to comment about about leaving libertarianism. So why don't I guess maybe it would be could we maybe start with what are some things that attracted you to it or you like about it, and then how that clashes with why you're thinking maybe this isn't the way to go anymore or something like that.
Yeah, and I think as it's always helpful in conversations like these just to try and set some definitions, because when we talk about libertarianism, I mean, that is like I said in the post, libertarianism, it's like Ben and Jerry's ice cream. It comes in all kinds of different flavors. So I mean, you have yeah, no, you go ahead. You might even be able to summarize it. I mean, it's a project. It's a head scratching project when you
it is, yeah,
and boil it down to say what is libertarianism.
They're all over the spectrum, like you outlined in your blog post on your website there. And just an easy example of this is the libertarians who were trying to pitch me out in high school were saying, we're going to legalize all drugs. And I'd say the best label for me right now politically is a libertarian, and I don't want to legalize all drugs. That sounds crazy to me. And they're all over the spectrum, like you say that. It's really it's not quite a equivocal term in the sense that people are trying to be disingenuous, but there's as many flavors of libertarians as there are self-described liberals, if not more so.
Yes. Let me pull up the post here just so I can. I wrote this a few days ago, somewhat off the cuff, and I've probably forgotten 90% of what I had to say. So,
that was off the cuff. That was pretty good. You had some pretty well-researched and reasoned arguments in there.
Well, it's one of those things where I've been in the libertarian world for so long. It's not like I had to, you know what I mean? I've just been steeped in it. So it's not, it's stuff that I can
I got you.
Prat off pretty easily. So, when it comes to, so then just the fact that you said you don't want to legalize all drugs tells me you're not especially in the libertarian camp that I'm aiming my critique at in this article. But we can make some distinctions there. So, kind of on the, I guess, one side of the libertarian spectrum, you do have the Rothbardians, and these would be kind of your classic anarcho-capitalist libertarians, right? And then you have a bunch of stuff in the middle, Chicago school libertarians, think of people like Milton Friedman, who was very popular, Hayekian libertarians. And then you have the sort of, libertarian conservatism. I gave the example of Ben Shapiro in my article, but I'm not even sure many libertarian conservatives would be willing to accept or include Ben Shapiro in that description. So I put that disclaimer there. Just because of his views on foreign policy, I think there would be a strong pushback there from many of our libertarian friends. But
libertarians tend to be much more isolationist leaning, following from where they try and get their groundwork. And Shapiro's more of a typical Republican not quite hawkish standing. That would be a little unfair, but more a typical Republican in foreign policy viewpoint.
Yeah, so I know he calls himself a libertarian, but I know every time he does, all the Facebook libertarian groups explode in outrage whenever he does that. And then you also have the sort of the left leaning libertarians as well. You have anarcho-communist libertarians, syndicalists, people like Noam Chomsky, and so on. So I mean, it really is all over the place. It's something. So in my critique, I really am trying to aim my arguments against what I would consider I guess in the Rothbardian camp, Phil, because that is where I've spent a lot of time. I'm a big fan of Rothbard in some areas. I'm not a fan in other areas. And Mises. So my original degree is economics. And I just remember constantly in college, just constantly going up against my Keynesian professors and arguing with them and battling with them, and just confounded that these people had never even heard of, people like Mises or Rothbard or like it's not even like they thought they were wrong. It's just that like they didn't even knew that they existed, and it's like it just blew my mind. So I'm educated in the a classic sort of Keynesian system of economics, but I've always been attracted to more of the Austrian leaning economists, and that was how I got into Rothbard. And then Rothbard, of course, has much more to say than just economic theory. He really is a grandfather or a godfather of much of libertarian thought, specifically political thought and ethical thought as well. So if I were to say that I'm almost certainly leaving libertarianism, I would say I'm probably ready to say my final goodbyes to Rothbard in certain respects. But I wouldn't say that I'm officially going to become a Republican, certainly not a liberal, right? So let me just, it's a provocative title, but let me qualify it heavily, as we often have to do in conversations.
Yeah, you have to qualify things heavily every time you're talking in a nuanced way. For people who aren't familiar with economics, could you, briefly, if possible, define what Keynesian economics is, what the Austrian school is, and things along those lines? Because those terms get thrown around a lot, but for people who haven't studied it like you do, they might not be quite familiar with what you're getting at there.
Sure. Yeah. So the Keynesian school is very mathematicized. It uses a lot of models. It typically favors interventionism, fine tuning of the economy, et cetera. I don't want to say that it's a reductionist school. Some people might, levy that charge, upon Keynesian, but it is a typical prevailing, economic theory. If you go to school for economics, you will be trained as a Keynesian, more or less. Whereas the sort of Rothbardian school, or in the line of Mises, the Austrian school, also known as praxeology, is more looking at a starting axiom like human action, and then just reasoning from that simple action to various conclusions that they would probably push back. Most of them, again, it's hard to say because there's many different Austrian economists. Some of them do favor the use of various models. Others reject those models. They think that they do more harm than good. But I will say, generally speaking, an Austrian economist is sort of arguing from first logical principles to various conclusions that that pretty heavily favor non-interventionism into the economy. So this is the key distinction, and promote for the greatest prosperity free market types of principles. It's not
okay. So to make it a little more practical, would it be fair, in your opinion, as somebody who's trained in economics, to say that both party of the Republican and Democratic Party follow the Keynesian model of economics then?
Almost entirely, that's the case.
Okay. Yeah,
with maybe an exception of Rand Paul, but he's even a little bit iffy. Sometimes it's hard to tell. But you sit down.
Yeah.
But the prevailing, I mean, it's just one of those things, right? I mean, the truth is an Austrian economist just isn't going to have much to do in politics, right? just by default, sort of box themselves out of that game. Naturally, Keynesianism lends itself to the political venture because it says that politicians have an active role that they can play in the economy. So, I mean, they're fundamentally different in both their approach of how they reach their conclusions and their application.
Okay. So again, making it a little more practical, if you did have a politician operating out of the Austrian model, he'd probably be saying things more like, I don't want the government involved in your economic life. I want to undo all these regulations because they're dumb. I don't want the government taxing you as much or as little as possible because the government just shouldn't be involved in that. If the government's involved in your business transactions, there's probably something wrong.
Yeah, or they might just go, say something like Rothbard would, is this: if he could just push one big button and make the government explode, then he would definitely do it. just take care of all of it at once. Yeah. So the general rule is that market interference from some type of centralized system typically does more harm than good, is what you're going to hear from most Austrian economists. And their big contributions, people like Mises or even Friedman. Now, Friedman isn't an Austrian. He's a Chicago school. So he would say that, since we have a government, since we have a Federal Reserve, we're probably not going to be getting rid of it. And there's even some practical utility in having it. But we should try to have it model or mimic a free economy as closely as possible. So he's kind of a middle ground type of guy there. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Austrians would say, no, let's get rid of the Federal Reserve. Let's get rid of government interventionism. So there are some people who kind of fall in between, and Milton Friedman would be a good example of that.
Yeah, I've heard that people have tried to level a critique like that against me when I've talked politics and economics, where they'd be like, well, you don't want to do all these various welfare programs, do you, Phil? And I'd be like, well, no. And they'd be like, well, what's going to happen to everybody who depends on them now? And I'd say, well, it'd be wrong to just snap your fingers and undo them because people depend on them. That'd be devastating. You need to scale it back in a way. So, this is just a off the cuff idea, but pay it out to everybody who's signed up to it now, but sign up nobody else. And maybe you'd have to extend it a little bit, say somebody was going to sign up for welfare tomorrow. Well, okay, you give it to them, but you don't give it to, say, my daughter who's 3 years old, and eventually you phase it out, which is the way I would do it. And be like, what? That's so reasonable. How can you call yourself a libertarian and take such a reasonable position? So,
well, I would side with you on that. I mean, there is just the ethical duty of fulfilling promises. You promise people something, especially if they've paid into it. I do think it would be wrong to just snap your fingers and explode that underneath their feet. I agree with you.
Yeah. There's a difference between what our pie in the sky abstract theory would be, if we were writing our own Plato's Republic, what we think the ideal state would be, and then what we can actually do on the real ground as far as making things better.
Yeah. And, Friedman, interestingly enough, had a number of those proposals. And I do like Friedman. I think he grows more sensible to me as I kind of am challenging my previous views of libertarianism here. He had his famous reverse income tax, which people could possibly liken to something like universal basic income. So, try and square that with libertarianism if you want. And
probably be hard to do,
and fixing various rates, through centralized authority as well. So he was somebody who was willing to use the arm of the government, but he wanted to aim it at what he thought would be the closest emulation of completely voluntary exchange or free enterprise or what have you, without actually exploding the entire system. Now, whether somebody who thinks that itself is a fantasy is, of course, another debate, right?
Exactly.
But he was somebody who was trying to find some type of middle ground there.
So obviously people can go to your blog and read the critique you've made there, but what's been your general critique, or the areas where you found libertarianism seems to be coming up short that makes you write the provocative title, "I'm just going to leave this behind"?
Yeah, well, I have to say, again, we have to make another distinction between, libertarian philosophy on the sort of the economic side and libertarian philosophy on the ethical side, and and how that sort of ties into the political side. And when you read libertarian political philosophers, a lot of them, I should say, maybe not most of them, but a lot of them aren't arguing from pragmatic economic utility. A number of them are arguing that libertarianism as a political philosophy gives us the best organizing principle for a pluralized society, for a society of people that hold many different beliefs, politically, religiously, what have you, and that the sort of system of libertarianism based on this idea of the non-aggression principle is the best way to maintain order in a pluralistic society. So that is their primary claim. And it's based off of the non-aggression principle, which somebody like Rothbard would heartily endorse, and we can get into what that means. And my critique is essentially against that claim. I do not think that it can achieve what they think it can achieve. So to the extent that you would either have to heavily qualify it to the point where I think it just becomes almost entirely pointless, or simply it's just really not impartial at all when you start to kind of drill down on libertarian political philosophy. So that is where I'm aiming my primary critique. It's an ethical, moral, and political critique, not an economic critique. I am still very much a free market economist. I'm still very much on the side of Mises, and then when it comes to I don't see that changing probably anytime soon. But the interesting note between Mises and Rothbard is Mises, when he got to the sort of ethical questions, always he often threw his hands up. He would say, look, economics is a system, it's a prudential system. If we know what we want, then economics can tell us how to get it. But economics can't tell us what we should want. Whereas Rothbard did try to push into the ethical domain. And that's where you get things like the non-aggression principle and trying to apply those to society as we know it, which is very pluralistic now.
Yeah. So the first thing, just to make clear, they're making a much, much stronger claim than what I think probably your typical person who would say I'm politically libertarian would make, or even what any other the major political parties in this country make, where they're saying this isn't just about politics and economics and how we govern. We're trying to make this about everything, where this is going to be the central principle for as you're saying, our morals, our ethics, our politics, our governance, everything.
That's correct. And now some may say, some will, and I know you talked about this in your comment in the post, Phil, and it's absolutely correct. Is some will draw the distinction between legal and moral, and some will say this is just our legal system. Others will say no, this should be our moral system as well. So we'll probably have to navigate through some of that as we work our way through here. But you're right. This is serious libertarian thought, as I like to call it. This isn't the stuff you'll get from high schoolers. This is the stuff you'll get in the journals when you read the libertarian philosophers. They really are trying to build a consistent political philosophy based off of this idea of the non-aggression principle. And Rothbard, for example, his famous essay, Ethics, the Ethics of Liberty, that is his project. That's exactly what he's trying to do. So I think you summarized it well.
Yeah. And I'll just be upfront, as you well know, that's where that's where I depart from most of them, where I say a lot of these ideas you're espousing, like even a form of the non-aggression principle, which we can talk about here in a bit. These are good ideas, I think, politically, legally, probably economically as well, but they don't work as a foundation for all morality and ethics. And that's, like you were mentioning, a distinction that I would want to draw, which separates me from them. Because, well, we can talk more about that as we go on. But why don't you explain what the non-aggression principle is then?
Yeah, the idea of the non-aggression principle is pretty easy to explain. It's that you just don't use coercion against people in the sense that you're trying to make them do things that they haven't consented to, right? So, the use of force against people in society is heavily frowned upon according to the non-aggression principle. And when you start from this, you can actually see how libertarians would wind up at what appear to be pretty, quote unquote, extreme positions, where they'll be against things such as taxation or conscription or whatever, because on some level, all those things do or would have to employ force. Right. So it'd be like, well, taxation doesn't require force. Well, just stop trying to pay your taxes for a while. And eventually somebody's going to show up at your door and force will be applied one way or another. I promise you. Right.
I saw something on the internet today where somebody was saying, what happened to that actor, Wesley Snipes? And, well, he went to jail for a few years because he didn't pay his taxes. There you go.
Yeah. So, there is a consistency there where if you start from the non-aggression principle, you will be led, and you're trying to make this as strong as you possibly can, like somebody like Rothbard would, and that's where my critique comes in. I would say, taken literally or taken in its strongest form, meaning you are never justified in aggressing against somebody else, except for maybe in situations of personal self-defense. I would say, taken in its strongest form, it leads to clearly immoral outcomes, and we can go through a couple of thought experiments there that I think highlight this. Or if you just start taking it non-literally, then it becomes almost vacuous, because then you just have to start qualifying it so heavily. Then you're like, well, what's the point? We're not even libertarian anymore. We're just back to conservatism, essentially, or a very thin libertarianism. So again, what's
an example of that? Go ahead and just follow that out.
Well, okay, so let's take one of the kind of the thought examples that I put in my my article, is that where there's clearly examples where some use of force or aggression is not only not immoral, but it's hard to see how you wouldn't have a positive moral obligation to use force or aggression in certain situations. So let's just take the easy stock example of child abuse, where you're walking out of a grocery store, you see some man just berating a young child with a tire iron. Just intuitively, I would hope that most people would say that, even if we don't physically harm this guy, we're not trying to kill him, hopefully, obviously some use of force or aggression would be merited here, at the very least, to try and restrain this man from beating this young boy to death. Now, I think even the strongest form, libertarians would say the boy has a right to defend himself. But if we're being consistent with the strong form of the non-aggression principle, we would be in violation of that as a third party trying to intervene in that situation. Now, people might say, well, that sounds ridiculous. Why would they stay in so firm on this? Well, you have to realize there's a slippery slope that you can potentially open up here by saying, if a third party can intervene in this type of situation, then why can't a country intervene in a similar type of situation? You see what I'm saying there? I feel like you could see how this could lead to justifying something like foreign interventionism, which almost all libertarians would reject. But at the same time, I would say that while that might be true in principle, we can argue against that in prudence or practice, first off. But secondarily, it is so obviously the right thing to do to intervene in a situation like this, especially if you feel the ability to have it, that the non-aggression principle is clearly an inadequate principle for at the very least, a moral system. But I would argue, even on top of that, even a basic legal system.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what about, and I think I mentioned this in my reply to your blog post. One thing I've often thought about when we're dealing with moral, ethical, and legal systems is there just isn't any one that works all the time. That is, even the very best ones, which I'll freely admit, I think the best ones are something along the lines of like Aristotelian virtue ethics or natural law theory, something along those lines. Even those ones you can construct a thought experiment where you can more or less show this doesn't quite work here.
Mm-hmm.
And so how is it that you're kind of not doing the same thing where the non-aggression principle is something that, say, works 95% of the time, but you found an example where it's like, it doesn't work this time, but the rest of the time it does? What makes your example
I guess
more universal?
So, and fair enough. I addressed this at the beginning of the article that I'm offering a critique here, not a solution. And it's always easier to be the critic who's tearing things down than it is the guy building things up. And fair enough. Give me that charge. But I guess in my defense, I would say I am a traditional natural law theorist. So I would say I think that works. I think traditional natural law works. And actually here, Rothbard and I are in agreement in the Ethics of Liberty. He gives a pretty decent overview and defense of traditional natural law theory. So the interesting thing, however, is I don't think that he is consistent with it when he then tries to drive the non-aggression principle through. So that's a longer conversation, because I do think that in terms of moral epistemology, I think traditional natural law theory is the strongest thing we have on offer on the market. And I would also agree that I think virtue ethics is a second there, and they obviously have close ties and roots back to Aristotle.
Yeah. I'd agree with you there, and I'm more or less saying that to play devil's advocate, because I do think your critique is actually pretty telling and a much bigger problem than just, you found the 1 to 5% of the time where it doesn't work, but the rest of the time it does. So
yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up, because, and this will be my part two, is I actually will want to further develop what I think will be the sort of natural outcomes politically of traditional natural law theory. And I think when you do that, you do get something like, and I haven't worked this all the way through, Phil, so be patient and gentle with me, right? But I think you will get something like a libertarian conservatism, and I got to keep working through this a bit. So if we'll have to budge on I think the hardcore. The funny thing from traditional natural law is that what flows from human nature is not just that we're social animals, but also political animals as well. So any type of anarchy is directly at odds with traditional natural law theory, which is very odd for somebody like Rothbard, who simultaneously wants to affirm both. I think he's just kind of put himself in a weird position there, and I think that's why his positions have problems morally, because he's not being consistent with traditional natural law theory. I think he's too dogmatically married to his sort of anarcho paradiso, his utopian anarchy and a non-aggression principle, that he's trying to kind of square the circle, so to speak.
You're never going to have utopia with anarchy. That's just ridiculous. I mean, have you ever met a family that doesn't have any rules? That's a group of people who are completely dependent on each other and have every vested interest in making sure things work. But if they don't have any rules, it's chaos, and the family becomes extremely dysfunctional.
Yep.
So how are you going to then translate that to a whole society, a whole community, a whole country, where people don't have a vested interest in seeing the good for each other, like you, at least in theory, do in a family? So.
Yes. Yeah. So that's where Rothbard, again, brilliant with his economics, but I think there's some serious flaws in his ethical systems. Another one that, and I don't know if you want to get into this too deeply, but I think it is relevant, and it is telling of another libertarian position that Rothbard held was abortion too, and how he would want to apply the non-aggression principle there. So you tell me if you want to start going down that road.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to do that. I did a whole podcast on abortion a while back. So yeah, I'm happy to go into that. Mm-hmm.
So first off, I will say that even just to be fair, there's people who hold to the non-aggression principle in its strongest form and are still against abortion. But Rothbard was not one of these people. So obviously some people would say that abortion just is a violation of the non-aggression principle. But I think Rothbard, and this is where he is smart and he's consistent, because I think he could see that if he conceded that, there might be a case for the state. There might be a case for some form of intervention. And Rothbard wanted to avoid that at all costs. So, I'll quote him and then we'll kind of work through this. And I think it itself is a problem, again, with this strong form of libertarianism. And really, I think, Phil, what we're getting at here, and you hinted at this, is the idea of rights in general. What are rights? Do only negative rights exist, but are there such things as positive rights? Do we have positive moral obligations that are owed to other people, which a strong form of libertarianism would deny? And if so, then that would be reason to reject a sort of strong form Rothbardian libertarianism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we'll kind of proceed step by step here and take it as we go. So Rothbard kind of famously takes the position of calling the child in the womb a parasite. So I'll quote him from his book For a New Liberty. What human has the right to remain unbidden as an unwanted parasite within some other human being's body? Now, I'm sure you've covered this, Phil, but in case people are unaware, this is, deeply scientifically incorrect. A parasite, by definition, entails a relationship between separate species. So he's just way off base on that. But to be fair to Rothbard, I'm not sure he really believed that. I think he was kind of using it as more of a rhetorical flourish to make
You think he was being a bit hyperbolic there, or
being a bit hyperbolic to make a point about property rights, I would say. So I won't want to critique him on a position I'm not sure that he was firmly committed. Like, I don't think he firmly believed that it was actually a parasite. I just if he did, then I'm really disappointed. I think really what he's trying to drive at is that there's this sort of utter sanctity and holiness about private property that is, sort of the absolute for to get the non-aggression principle in the way he would like it off the ground, is that there must be an utter respect of somebody's private property. And I think that's probably what would lead him to, say this about the child in the womb. But the problem here ethically, and actually, do you mind if I just read the paragraph from my article?
Not at all. I thought you gave some good arguments there. I think.
Okay, yeah. So against abortion, I think we have a fundamental contradiction here, which is surprising that somebody like Rothbard wouldn't catch it, because he's a pretty smart guy. So I'll just quote myself here, because somebody's got to do it. So the problem with respect to abortion and property rights has to do with that between something having instrumental value or intrinsic value. And what we need to realize is that the non-aggression principle is only an appealing legal and moral axiom insofar as it affirms that people are intrinsically valuable. And because of that, their lives and freedom and property, etc., should not be interfered with. So far, so good, so far as it goes. But when we apply just a little bit more pressure, we can see the cracks beginning to emerge. For example, with respect to property, many ethicists would say property is only something of instrumental value, if it has any value at all. And the reason we believe people have a right to property, if we believe they have a right to property, not everyone does, is because people are valuable in and of themselves, and because they have a right to sustain themselves in existence, they have a right to acquire property in order to do so. Property itself is not intrinsically valuable, but human beings are intrinsically valuable. So property only acquires value in virtue of its relationship to the intrinsic value of human beings and its seeming necessity to support human life, since to deprive a person of the right of property, as many libertarians would argue, would be essentially to starve them to death, and would be in violation of what is commonly referred to as a negative right. In many respects, this has roots in John Locke, but it has a basis in traditional natural law as well. Now, here's the fundamental logical obstacle with abortion. The case being made for abortion as a measure of respect for another person's property is therefore elevating something only of instrumental value over something of intrinsic value. And it is here we have a straightforward contradiction. For example, we only care about a woman's privacy or property because we only care about the value of a woman, more specifically human beings, to begin with. So in any case where we then put the value of property over the value of human life, we have undermined the very moral foundations we need for a respect of private property to begin with, legally or otherwise. The position is philosophically unstable. To respect a woman's privacy and or property is, by either implicit or explicit admission, to respect the value of that woman by virtue of her inclusion in the human species, which we consider intrinsically valuable. But then to advocate for abortion, that is the killing of an innocent human being, through private property or privacy, is just to erase the very thing of intrinsic value we need to support anything of instrumental value.
Yep.
Sorry for the mouthful there, but
No, that was very good. I think you're absolutely right. It's as though the error Rothbard is making is he's failing to recognize that we don't get our value from private property. Rather, it's that private property gets our value from us, that is, human beings. And he kind of reversed that order, and that's what led him to that. And as you've rightly pointed out, that leads to all kinds of contradictions if you actually spell it out.
Yeah, thank you for making that way more concise. I should have just consulted you before I wrote the article.
Well, if you're going to do serious philosophy, unfortunately, you have to write it and spell it out in gross detail like that, when really it's often the case that you could say it in 3 or 4 sentences. I've been to far too many philosophy conferences where people will spend an hour talking about something and you could summarize the point, even when it's a really good one, in about 5 minutes.
Yes. Yes. Peter Kraft is amazing at that for some reason.
He's pretty good at that. That's very true. Yeah, I enjoy reading him and listening to him for much that reason. So
yeah, so we don't even have to settle the abortion debate. Obviously, I'm exceedingly pro-life, and I think that if the government has any responsibility at all, it's to help protect the lives of innocent human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So one can immediately see how a strong form commitment to the non-aggression principle would not be impartial in a pluralistic society. Because whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, I think that you could admit, unless you're, really obstinate, that there are reasonable people on both sides of this debate. As much as unreasonable as I think that the pro-choice position is, I will admit that there are people on that side that are reasonable people. They're not like jihadists, right, or legitimate Nazis, which is another thing, right? It's like, again, for libertarianism, if you think that this will be an impartial organizing principle in a pluralistic society, you have to be able to explain how that would ever be the case in a society where people like Nazis or jihadists would exist. And I don't see how that could ever be the case.
It kind of assumes that everybody's going to be reasonable, or at least make an attempt to do that. But read a history book and you're immediately going to see, no, there are people who are unreasonable. There's always people who are unreasonable in every society. Even a society that has most people who are trying to be reasonable, you're still going to have people on the fringes, even if it's like a 1% of the population or less who just want to be serial killers. Well, what are you going to do about them? So
I think that's the primary point that I wanted to kind of wrap up here, and then we can jam back and forth. Actually, do you mind if I just do one more quote? Because it's
not at all.
Okay, so after I made the comment about the jihadists, I say, all right, let's be as charitable as we can and limit the impartiality claim of libertarianism to a pluralistic society of people who generally don't think killing people who disagree with them is the best way of handling human affairs. Does libertarianism still work? Well, it's hard to see how, and this is where I am personally stuck and may have to abandon the project entirely. Because what if disagreements on, say, sorry to have to bring this up again, but abortion? Because either abortion is the direct killing of an innocent human being or it isn't. But if it is, then if the government has any role at all, surely that role is to protect innocent human life. And so this very well could be a possibility where some degree of aggression is merited, again, leading to qualifications of the non-aggression principle, which is just what somebody like Rothbard was hoping to avoid. And surely that wouldn't be impartial to people who think such a mandate somehow infringes upon their right to privacy, property, etc. Or, as another example, just to get off the abortion topic, pornography, which some feel is a form of sexual liberation and expression, and others a barbaric vice that degrades not only the sexual act itself, but women especially. Particularly women who are kidnapped and enslaved for the reasons of producing pornographic material. While such a vice may not directly violate the non-aggression principle, except, of course, in the latter example, many would argue the habit is so morally degrading that any truly good society should outlaw the production and pornography and viewing of pornography outright. Or what about the role of religion upon the state or lack thereof? Or prohibition, drug restrictions, etc., or people running around naked in plain view? These are serious, incompatible issues of which various positions are held among entirely reasonable parties. Well, maybe not the one with the people running around naked, but who knows with the way society is going today. So libertarianism doesn't seem to have any way to be impartial to these types of concerns which to me, Phil, seem like the biggest concerns or among the biggest concerns in society today. So really what we're saying is that it would not be an impartial organizing principle for society. And in that sense, in the most fundamental sense, the entire project of at least a Rothbardian ethical legal system for society, I think, is a complete failure. And it's something that I have tried to make sense of and try to make work for a number of years now, but I just don't think that I can, especially not in alignment with traditional natural law. And so that's where I'm pretty much at with this.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, go ahead and throw some thoughts and comments at me.
Well, I think your critique is right in that you're coming after that strong Rothbardian sense of libertarianism where it's trying to be about everything. And I'd agree with you there that it doesn't really work as a foundation for all of our morality, all of our ethics, because what Rothbard is trying to do, if I'm understand you correctly, is he's trying to find one underlying principle or just a very small set of underlying principles to ground everything, which in many senses is what a good philosopher tries to do. That's what Plato tried to do with his forms, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So he's trying to, in a certain sense, although he might resist this if we talk to him, say that he's making the non-aggression principle kind of like the Plato made his forms as the ground for everything. And I think your critique is pretty spot on in saying, no, this doesn't work for everything, because there's clear examples where we'd either have to say it's wrong or qualify it to such a degree that then it dies the death of 1,000 cuts because we've qualified it here, we've qualified it here, we've qualified it here. Then what are we left with? But the reason that I've kind of fallen into being a libertarianism is that I think it works very, very well in economics and political philosophy, not in moral or ethical philosophy, but in political philosophy. Mm-hmm. Because the best summation of this I ever heard was from the great statesman of our country, Thomas Jefferson, who said, "The government that governs least governs best." Mm-hmm. At least I think he said that. I heard somebody quoting him, but I never bothered to look that up. So I got that wrong.
Maybe it was Mark Twain. Maybe it was Einstein. All these, those are like Jefferson, Twain, and Einstein are always like the three guys that have so many quotes attributed to them that were never actually out of their mouths. But it just looks good. And Bruce Lee,
yeah. But at the same time, I would say if you go read what Jefferson actually said, his political philosophy and the things he wrote, like the Declaration of Independence and so on, he really held this idea: the government that governs least governs best. Mm-hmm. And well, you mentioned Ben Shapiro a little bit earlier, so I heard him make this reference, and it's telling. But he said, that's because government is like the ring of power in Lord of the Rings. It destroys virtually everything it touches. And so the best way to have a good society, well, maybe not the best way, but one of the best ways, is to keep government as far away from everything as possible and only involve it as an absolute last resort. Mm-hmm. And that's what I take to be more of a libertarian political and economic philosophy, wherein something along the lines of a non-aggression principle or your own rational self-interest works very, very well, I think, in economics. It doesn't work very well when you're trying to have a good relationship with your wife and children. In fact, it's terrible there.
That's exactly right.
You don't want to be selfish there. You want to be selfless. But you want to be selfish to some reasonable degrees when you're running a business or engaging in economic activity. You want to use it to better yourself. And a side effect of seeming to use economics and things like that to better yourself selfishly is it makes things better for lots of people. It's very kind of odd, but we all know from just living in the world, it's terrible when you're dealing with your friends and family and your personal relations, which is why it doesn't work for a moral foundation. But I think it tends to work very, very well, or at least in theory does, for economics and political philosophy, or politics, excuse me. And so that's the immediate, you appealed to that distinction at the start, and that's where I would say, well, I think you're right in critiquing that strong form because it doesn't work there. Mm-hmm. But the libertarians would do well to maybe get away from that strong form and say, hey, we just want to follow Thomas Jefferson. We just want to get the government out of your life and let you do whatever you want, which in a certain sense, this is obviously controversial for other reasons because it conflicts with natural law theory. But if you're gay and want to get married and just live your life, we don't want the government involved in that because it's not the government's business. And you might disagree with that, and that's okay. Okay in the sense that we can disagree, but you can easily kind of see how that would follow from, well, the government just destroys everything it touches, so why not get out of businesses like marriage and other social institutions and let society kind of organically deal with that instead of it passing laws and things along those lines?
Yeah, there's so much that can be said about that. So generally, I absolutely agree with you. I think that if you follow, like I said, if you follow traditional natural law through, you get, again, I think something like either libertarian conservatism. You definitely get limited government. That's in there because you have to through traditional natural law have a respect not just for the individual but the family unit as well, the family structure as well. So any type of agitation for a collective regime or a very strong centralized government is going to be fundamentally at odds with that ethical theory pretty early on.
Absolutely.
You can certainly make principled arguments from traditional natural law for certain forms of social welfare programs. I think that can be done. And I think those arguments are not objectionable morally outright. I think where you got to have those arguments are on the level of economic and prudential considerations. Well, are they actually achieving the things that we think they'll achieve, or are they not? So that I think things like that no longer are moral questions. I think we do have a moral basis in principle for things like that, but it's more of a prudential consideration there. But going back,
yeah, I did a whole podcast on that a while back, where I said, if you're a Christian, you just have a flat out moral obligation to do your best to try and care for the poor and disenfranchised around you. Go read the Bible if you doubt that. It's clearly there.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But then the question is, how are you going to do that? And what I argued in that podcast is, when you look at the practical reality of it, the government is very, very bad at doing that. So you shouldn't use the government.
This is correct. Again, with you there. As far as, and I think this is a problem of liberalism, if I can speak frankly, I think liberalism is a freak show. And I think to
look at the Democratic candidates right now.
Yeah, and this is
hard to say otherwise.
I think this is the problem again of liberalism and libertarianism of being, impartial, just do what you want, because it assumes that if you just let people do what they want and you don't provide any sort of legal signaling of a deeper moral structure, and I would argue that has to be natural law, well, then eventually what people are going to want to do is take over your life. And they're going to want to form a collective. And they're going to want to bring in National Socialism because they have lost all of their moral foundations and what I think is the correct foundation of traditional natural law theory. And if traditional natural law theory is correct, the implications there are not only exceedingly conservative, but they're also religious in the sense that it would actually be hard to say that you should have a separation. Certainly you could have a separation of church and state, but you probably should not have a separation of state and the recognition of at least a mere theism on traditional natural law theory. So there are certain very strong religious connotations as well. From natural law flows that we have, certain not just religious dispositions, but obligations as well. I mean, even Aristotle said this, and he wasn't a Christian, right? To know and serve God. So it's not like you need to look at the Bible to figure this out. This can be all figured out rationally as well. Then the question, I think, Phil, becomes how if we affirm traditional natural law, and we could do a whole podcast on that, then the question becomes, how much should the legal system ride the moral system, right? How close should that line be? If we have a state that is there to kind of keep the order in society in line with what we believe are the morally right or wrong things to do, then again, it becomes a matter of, okay, well, just because we should, can we? It flips around, right? Not just because we can, should we, but just because we should, can we? And this is where you have great divergence. I mean, you even have people like Thomas Aquinas, one of the champions of traditional natural law theory, who obviously thought something like prostitution was immoral, but maybe it shouldn't be outlawed.
I recall him making that argument where I was like, oh, he anticipated my libertarian thought. All right.
Once again, Aquinas was so far ahead of everybody even today. But that's one of that is still the classic pestering question, right? Where, okay, clearly he's not pro prostitution. He thinks it's an objective moral wrong, but he would have made the argument that maybe we shouldn't be so quick to outlaw it outright because it might lead to worse effects overall in doing so. So that's where the things like pornography come in, drug use comes in, even things like gay marriage come in. Would the detrimental effects of something like that in society, and it's hard. I think we're getting some data now, Phil, of what happens when we start kind of conceding these moral grounds, and we literally see the freak show that liberalism has become. It's not just letting people become married. Now it's you have to accept my pronouns, right? This is the result of letting people just do what they want and leave me alone. But then what happens is they don't leave you alone. So I don't, as much as I appreciate Jefferson's sentiment, which is very libertarian, I don't know if it's sustainable. I don't know if it is.
Okay.
I don't know if it is, at least without a solid legal reflection, if not outright enforcement of something that is close to traditional natural law. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and that's the fundamental argument between the conservative approach and the more libertarian approach that I tend to fall into, which is, at what point should the government be, this is kind of a loaded phrase, and I don't mean it that way, but at what point should it be legislating morality? And if you tend to think it probably should, you're probably going to fall more on the conservative side, although, of course, there's ways to nuance that. And if you tend to think, well, probably not, because it tends to make things worse when it tries to do that, you're probably going to fall more on, I guess, by the terms we've been using here, a more libertarian light position, much more libertarian politics and economics only, not moral in the Rothbard sense that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And I grew up well, I'll freely admit, not virtually, but a lot of people in my family are Republicans. And so when I talk to them about why you should be a little bit more libertarian, they tend to give me similar arguments to what you've made, which is, well, the government needs to be in the business of legislating all these things. And I can kind of see the pull of that, because on the one hand, I'm like, well, yeah, I kind of can see how, or at least see the pull of why society might seem better if you started doing that. But my skepticism about that is that when you have something that's as intrinsically powerful as the state, I think it's going to cause all kinds of unintended consequences whenever it bears down on something like that, even if it's done with the best intentions. And that's assuming that you have a legislature that actually does things like write laws with the best of intentions without throwing all these add-ins in, that actually thinks about what it's doing, as opposed to passing bills at the last moments, sometimes the last seconds, as they've done with budget bills in our country. So even then, I'm kind of like, well, you just can't always see all the unintended consequences. And part of when I came to this conclusion is I wrote an essay about the Johnson's Great Society, how he founded most of the welfare and public aid programs that we're now doing. And the reality is those have caused massive unintended consequences, which are extremely negative. Mm-hmm. But you go back and look at the intentions of the people who founded them. It wasn't, hey, we're going to make people dependent on the government. All those conspiracy theories that people espouse are clearly wrong. Just go read what people said about why they were doing this. Mm-hmm. But it caused all these incredible unintended consequences where, even though they had the best of intentions, it probably has done more harm than good that they did all this stuff.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So that's why I then say, when somebody's like, well, you brought up the pornography example earlier. And that's a good example, because I agree with you that pornography is, at least in general, immoral, although people can sometimes disagree about whether or not, this R-rated movie with a sex scene in it is pornography versus Playboy being pornography. But that aside, pornography is immoral. Well, what should the government do about it? Well, I have a suspicion, and I don't know if I could confirm this because there isn't data on this like there is with the welfare state and the public aid programs. But I'm suspicious, at least, that if the government made pornography illegal, there would probably be massive unintended consequences that would be worse than simply allowing it to be legal and then, like you talked about the women who are sold into sex slavery and trafficked for those kind of things, and still going after those because that's clearly wrong, regardless of whether pornography is involved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. So I think we're actually in substantial agreement for pretty much all of this. I would say just regarding pornography, my stance is that I don't know. I don't know if outlawing that would have better or worse implications. I guess the only thing I would say is that when it comes to certain things, the moral gravity of the situation can be so high that various certainly economic considerations really aren't considerations at all. And an example of this would be slavery, right, classically. And I would also say abortion, right? I mean, so one of the the classic arguments for slavery was, hey, if we abolish slavery, this is going to tank the economy of the South, and that argument was correct. That's exactly what happened. But it doesn't matter. This was just such an objectively wicked thing that no economic benefit could ever have supported the maintaining of slavery. As I would argue, even if it's true, even if it's true that abortion gives us economic benefits, it doesn't matter. It should be outlawed because it is so objectively wicked. The moral gravity of that situation is so high. That it is just, if we're going to have any society at all and any function of the state at all, it needs to maintain a legal system that will prohibit these things. Now where that falls on certain things like pornography, which I think again is an immoral thing, but not quite up there, obviously, with abortion or slavery. I don't know. I really don't. And it's something that I would leave to a trained statesman or have to spend significant amount of time studying. There are, I guess the kind of interesting thing that we could do is look at various states. And even though we might not like the way that they rule, we can look at various Muslim countries who do enforce morality and see what some of the implications are there. Now, I don't know what they are. I'm just saying that we could get some data, right?
Yeah. I think the trouble you'd run into there is, as best as I know, most of the countries that currently do that are Muslim countries. So,
well, that's what I'm saying, right? So say what you want about how those countries are ruled, and I think that itself is a problem. They at least tell us something about what happens when you do try to enforce morality, and in pretty much every level of a person's life. And again, say what you want about it, I think it's wrong the way they do it. If there's something we can learn from these Muslim countries, is that, for better or worse, and I think in their instance a lot it's for worse, it can actually be done. It can actually be done and is being done, where people's lives are essentially morally dictated to an incredibly fine degree. And it gets done. So I actually think that a lot of no, don't get me wrong, that's like the absolute opposite of where I would stand politically on almost everything. But I think when people make these sort of charges that there's always going to be worse consequences from legal, using the legal system to enforce morality, there's enough countries out there where it seems like that might not be the case. Or if there are consequences, they'll be short-term or initial or abrupt, but then things will even out over time. Now, the particular details, I would say, I don't know when it comes to things, again, like pornography or drug use. Because I'm with you, I do not think all drugs should be legalized, not at all. But I probably don't think that all drugs should be outlawed either. I don't know if we've got it right. I don't know, right?
The way our country handles drug laws, there's clearly something wrong with it. It's not working. Now, what the solution is, that's a whole nother question. But all you have to do is look around and see how easy it is to buy illegal drugs and how there's such an opiate epidemic and so many things like that to know the way our country's handling it is clearly not working. So
and certainly just the system of retribution and punishment there seems to be a little odd to be as charitable as I can about it as well. So these are the really interesting sort of detailed questions that I freely admit I haven't worked any of these out yet. I would say, coming from a traditional natural law perspective, again, I think you're I think at most you're going to get a state that that sort of shields those basic, and I would argue eternal and most important, moral truths that we as Christians would obviously recognize, right? The right to life, the sanctity of the individual, the family unit. But within that structure would be an enormous emphasis on smaller communities within churches to fund, hopefully to fund the social means that people would need, so they aren't dependent on the state, right?
Yeah.
And it's
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would just say it's no surprise. I think this is one of the things with the founding fathers is like the founding fathers, if you take the time to read them, and I know you have, Phil, but so many people haven't, it's like they assumed Christianity. I'm not saying all of them were explicitly Christian, but if you read Adams and Jefferson and Washington and Hamilton, they all assumed that the moral population would be maintained by Christianity, and that had to be maintained for their idea of government to work. So, in that sense, it's hard to even say that they really even believed in separation of church and state. If anything, they believed in separation of church and denomination, and that's really it. But Christianity to them was that sort of guide, and it was all natural law theory. It really was. I mean, Locke would have rejected the metaphysics of it, but politically he was a natural law theorist. There's no doubt about it. And Jefferson borrows heavily from him. So our country is wired from traditional natural law theory, and they more or less assumed probably that would have been the case. They probably never would have guessed that we would have had things like Scientology or Mormonism or atheism running rampant in our country. They probably would have never have guessed that we would be as pluralistic as we were. They might have thought that people would have differed, probably like you and I do, Phil, on like theories of salvation or atonement, right?
They would have thought, we're going to have Lutherans, Catholics, and evangelicals, not we're going to have Buddhists, Hindus, and Christians.
Exactly, right? Exactly. Or humanists, God help us. And so I guess there's this, I guess they were kind of in a way, assuming that church, the church in the loosest sense would still be there to guide the state. It was in fact Washington that said true religion is the security of the state. I like that he said true religion, not just any religion. True religion is the security of the state. And I guess, if I'm working through my critiques of Rothbard here, that's kind of what I'm keep coming back to. And it kind of, every time I try and dip into political philosophy, I think it spits you back up into the metaphysical questions and the religious questions. Can you even have a state or society apart from considering what, if any, religion is true is another thing. I don't know if you can, because I think we're seeing the results of that now, where there's sort of this indifferentism on those questions, whereas the founding of our country and what emerged as one of the greatest societies of all time emerged precisely from the natural law foundations and the Christian principles that made it possible. And we've just so far departed from all of that the liberalism has remained, but the sort of moral soil or foundation has almost been completely exploded.
Yeah. And, well, I know we're getting close to the end of the time, but let me try and bring things a little full circle and say, well, here's where I think something like the non-aggression principle in politics, but not in morality, can help us quite a bit. Because, like, we would want to say that things like rape and murder are explicitly wrong and the government needs to intervene. Well, the non-aggression principle clearly says that's wrong, and therefore, if we apply the government, it can intervene there. But then say something like pornography, well, that's a little bit of a trickier thing, where it's not immediately clear if that's transgressing against anyone, if it's violating anyone's will, except in cases like you referenced where there's sex slavery and things like that going on. And then you can immediately turn around and say, but that's the reason why the government's justified in intervening there, not because it's pornography, but because people are being held against their will and exploited and things along those lines. And so that's one of like I talked earlier about how Ben Shapiro said the government's the ring of power from Lord of the Rings. It destroys everything. And so that's where I would say that's kind of a limiting principle you can use, where you can say only when somebody's rights as a human being are being transgressed. And it's pretty clear that that's what's happening, where it's not like a borderline case where somebody says this business didn't refuse to serve me, even though there's another one that can do the same thing across the street. Well, it's not entirely clear that they're
did he just get sued a third time? This case,
that guy in Colorado, yeah, he got sued a third time. Well,
unbelievable.
it is unbelievable. Yeah, it's not as immediately clear that that person's rights have been transgressed as it is in the cases of rape and murder and things along those lines. So, bracketing out borderline or gray cases for the moment, I think you can then turn around and say something like this is a good way to justify, here's where we can say the government intervenes and here's where we can say it shouldn't. And there will be gray cases where it's not as immediately clear. I don't think the Colorado banker is one. It's pretty clear no one's rights were violated there. But there are cases where it's not immediately clear. Was this person's rights violated or what were they not? And there'll always be gray cases like that. But that's why I call myself a political libertarian, is because something like that, I think, works really, really well in politics, where I think the government has to meet a very big burden of proof to justify intervening. And if it meets that in where people's rights are clearly being transgressed, that seems to meet it to me. Whereas if it's, I'm not getting paid as much as my coworker, even though we both negotiated our salary. No, that clearly does not meet it. Your rights aren't being transgressed by that. You're probably just not as skilled as your coworker, and maybe you should do something about it on your own instead of whining at the government.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Definitely with you there. I guess the only thing I would say is everything that you just outlined and that you would, I think, want in a society, I would say, is just as doable with a more moderate libertarian conservatism as it would be with a strong form non-aggression principle.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that. And I probably would fall more into a moderate camp than, because I don't see, like you were describing in this strong sense of libertarianism, it clearly does not work as a founding principle. It clearly doesn't work in moral theory and ethical theory. But I think it works, as I said, very well in political and economic theory. And so that's just the distinction I draw. So.
Yeah, well, even legal theory, I would say it wouldn't work because, you would be you would have been legally persecuted for defending that young boy.
Ah, okay.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I was conflating legal and political in the way I was talking about there. But yeah, good point. You're right.
Yeah, or even in legal theory, it doesn't work as well because, again, and Rothbard said this himself, and somebody, I think was it Walter Block, might have argued the same thing. I don't want to misattribute to him, so people can fact check me on that. This is a serious thing. Was that a parent could effectively leave their child to starve to death, right? That under the strong form of non-aggression principle, there would be no legal ramifications against that person. And that is, again, another example where I think that this clearly breaks down, not just as a moral, but also a legal system.
Good point.
Because this brings positive rights right into the conversation, which I think we might have to save for a part two, but I do believe positive rights exist. I believe children have a positive right to be cared for by their parents.
Absolutely.
Just as parents have a positive right to be listened to by their children, even if they aren't quite old enough to understand that yet.
Absolutely,
right, it's there. And I think that.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, and I think that is something. I think that is something our legal system should reflect, not necessarily on the children's side, but certainly on the adult side and their obligations owed to their children.
And it clearly does. That's why they force parents who abandon their children to pay child support at times. And it doesn't do it perfectly, but there's clearly a recognition in our legal system that there is some kind of an obligation there, even though they don't always enforce it the best way they could.
Yep, and that's a good thing, even if it's not implemented perfectly, but it's a bad thing in the sense that the state starts to replace the parent. So there again, you have this sort of natural edge or protection of natural law against the collective, because it is the parent that owes the obligation to the kid, not the state. So that's something that I think is worth exploring as well. And so the problem with the strong form NAP, even legally, is that I think drawing the line at only negative rights, especially private property, is too short. Not obviously morally, but even legally as well. But I think we can find something that would be satisfying to both of us in a libertarian conservatism, Or maybe we'll just have to hop right to a theocracy. It's one of the one of the two at this point. I don't know if there's a middle ground left.
Well, as long as we're talking political theory, I'll put out here that I've always maintained, and I think anybody who's honest would maintain, the best form of government that there could possibly be would be an absolute dictatorship where the dictator always does what is right.
Yeah,
that would be wonderful.
Benevolent dictatorship, of course.
Yeah, where he always does what's right and is benevolent. But of course, you're never going to get that in a real human society, because even if you pick the best person possible, he's still going to make some wrong decisions, and power corrupts. So
yeah, even if he is morally great, he's not omniscient. He's
exactly
not or she. He or she is not all knowing. So yeah, I think we're gonna have to make this a part 2, Phil. This has been too much fun, man. I've been really enjoying jamming on these ideas.
Oh, I'd be happy to.
You're helping me think these things through as well, which I appreciate.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think you've offered, as I said, some really, really good critiques of the strong libertarian position, and I just encourage you, if when you say leave libertarianism, you mean I'm going away from that and more toward a more moderate thing, I'd say great, welcome aboard. That's where I am.
Yeah, I'm coming toward you, Bill, not away from you.
Yeah. If you're wanting to leave the moderate one, I'd say no, come back. This makes sense. So.
Yeah. No, I think we're winding up on the same base here at the end of the day. So, good stuff, man. Very good stuff.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for talking to me. And if we can do a part 2, I'm very much looking forward to that. So the audio got a little choppy there at the end, and I apologize for that. That was internet problems of some kind, and I'm not sure if that was on my part or somewhere else down the line. But I hope you really enjoyed Pat and I's conversation. I know I really did, and he said he really did. But write in, let me know what you think as always. What do you think of libertarianism? Do you disagree with Pat's assessment that the stricter variants of it are kind of irrational or lead to problematic conclusions? Do you disagree with me that a more moderate variant of it that only applies the libertarian ethic to, say, politics and economics is a better way to go? Write in, let me know what you think. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and you can find me at the Facebook group I set up for the podcast, The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a search for that. It'll pop right up. And as always, if you like what I'm doing here on the podcast, share it on social media, rate it on one of the podcast sites like iTunes, just to get it out to more people. Thanks again for listening. I'll be back again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.